So the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights has been introduced in the Illinois State House of Representatives. And what it does is it provides protections for all types of domestic workers. It could be housekeepers, home management, caregivers, cooks, companions, nannies. It runs across the gamut. What it ensures is that employers are accountable to their employees. It establishes requirements when it comes to pay, meals, sleep time, rest time, and termination notice. It doesn't reinvent the wheel, but what it does do is it gives hardworking individuals the same rights and protections that they should have in any job across the board. It's just human nature, we should have a job. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about different parts of the legislation. When it comes to working time, the bill says that an employer has to pay a domestic worker for all the hours that they do work. Seems pretty basic to me. If you're working those hours, you should be paid those hours. The only time that isn't considered work time under this legislation is if you have at least 30 minutes to yourself, or sleep time, but we'll get into a little bit more sleep time in just a little bit. Well, let's get into sleep time now, since I've already addressed it. It says unless there's an emergency, a domestic worker should get at least 8 hours of rest, which is so important because how can you work at your full potential if you are not rested? There are different considerations in the legislation if there is an emergency, but without that emergency, that should be given at least hours. When we're talking about rest time, the bill also addresses housing and meals. What it does say is if your employer is an employer where you spend your nights at that residence, you need to have proper housing. You need to have a private area for sleeping, for dressing. You need to have reasonable access to a restroom, to laundry facilities, et cetera, et cetera. You know, it's so funny because you read this and you're like, really, that needs to be written out. People are being taken advantage of that, and it's true. People are. And unfortunately, some people need to have the writing in front of them so they know what they're doing is the right thing. Because the real goal behind here is let's do the right thing. The employer also cannot charge employees for meals that are given to the worker during the work time, which totally makes sense as well. And that's another frustration that we actually have to put this in this legislation. It's not just a no-brainer. It's something that people need to know. If a domestic worker is fired or terminated, they have to be given 2 weeks' notice. You're given 2 weeks' notice everywhere else. You need to be given this 2 weeks' notice in a domestic situation as well. If your employer isn't paying unemployment insurance, then you deserve a severance package, and that's part of this legislation too. There are also stipulations in the legislation that have to do with paid time off, your right to privacy. Again, these are issues that any workers in any other field would just expect. And the fact of the matter is we do have to put it in writing to make sure it is fulfilled for domestic workers as well. To further protect the worker, the legislation says employers have to keep records. They have to document hours. They have to talk about what is the rate of pay. How much are you paid during each pay period? And you also have to have a written contract. Under this bill, it says the Department of Labor would create that contract, and they would do that contract in a number of different languages because we know the fact that domestic workers, sometimes English is not the first language. And you want a contract to be something that you understand. Even if it is in English sometimes, I don't understand it. So we want to make people as comfortable as possible. What I'm finding amazing is when you really study this bill, we should have the perfect work environment. This isn't something that we should have in legislation. It's just something that should be expected. And unfortunately, as I said, it's not. Let's see. What else does it tell us here? So basically, what the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights does is it corrects the issues that we've had in the past. The people who sat down and wrote this legislation talked to people who were in the workplace, and these people said, this is what went on. These are the problems that need to be addressed, and this is how we need to address them. And that's what's so important here, because it's not me making up the rules. It's people who've actually had their boots on the ground and says, we've been in these situations, and these situations are wrong, and we have to make them right for future generations. Because these are, what would we do if we didn't have people to fill these positions? And we need to treat our employees or employers with dignity and respect in order to get the job done. Oh, so the question is, where is this bill in Springfield right now? The problem is right now it's at a standstill. We have a number of people who signed on, like myself, as co-sponsors of the legislation that says we believe that this is legislation that's important and we move it forward. This is where we need help. Because as legislators, we can talk ourselves blue in the face. However, if you keep silent, you are not heard. So this is why we need to work together. Everybody needs to find out who is their state representative, who is their state senator, and how do you contact the person. Through a phone call, through a letter, through an email. It's very important that we start pushing this legislation. We have to make sure that every legislator and the governor knows that this is an important bill and we need this bill to pass. Working together gives us a stronger voice. Because as one person, you could sit on a street corner and scream your lungs out and people are going to walk by you. But as soon as we have a larger group pushing this legislation, that's where we're going to start to see progress. Like I said, right now, it's at a standstill. We might not see movement on this legislation before the end of May because the end of this month is the end of the session. But there is a saying that nothing ever dies in Springfield. So what that means to us is it's going to come back again. Whether you like it or not, there are some important pieces of legislation that will continue to be pressed forward, and sometimes it takes a couple of years to get something through. That does not mean you give up. That means you work even harder to make sure that the legislation gets through. So for our group, that means we have the summer to really start pushing this bill. We have the summer not only to talk to our elected officials, but talk to our communities to get more people on board with this legislation. Because the more people who know about it, the more people are going to say things like I did before. Isn't that a no-brainer? And no, it's not. We have to make sure that this gets out here. So we need to talk to our friends. We need to talk to our neighbors. And we need to make sure that this legislation gets pushed through. And like I said, if we are a group voice instead of one personal voice, that's going to help us so much more to get the job done. And again, we cannot be discouraged that the bill does not come through this year. It was just introduced, and many times there are bills that take many years to get through. So what is going to get through this year, and what are we talking about now in Springfield? The budget. And this is where I need your help as well. Oh, yeah. So, I'm glad you can laugh with me, because if we're not laughing, we're crying. So what's going on with the budget right now in Springfield? Well, you probably are already aware that our income tax rolled back in January. We were at 5%, now we are at 3.75%. What that means is we have a $6 billion shortfall in our budget from this year to last year. There are those of us who have really come out there and said, we need to look at new revenues. We cannot have this budget hole, because who's going to be hurt by the budget hole? It's going to be the people who need the most help. And we saw that just a few weeks ago when the governor worked to fix the 2015 budget and swept many funds. And then on Good Friday, we called it the Good Friday Massacre, because the governor cut funding to autism, to immigrant services. It was awful. Well, there was such an outcry that all of a sudden that money's been refound. And as of last, I think, Friday, those services are now funded through the rest of 2015. But the writing's on the wall. We need to work together, and we need to make sure that the issues that we need funded are funded. If I could tell you one little story about how the income tax really affects people who are vulnerable versus people who are on the other end of the scale. Rumor has it that when the income tax rolled back from 5% to 3.75%, our governor got a $750,000 tax break. So, yeah. So we really know who's being hit by these budget cuts. And it's not the people at the upper level, it's the middle class and the lower class and the vulnerable, the people who do need the most help. So this is where I'm coming to you to say, help me please. Because we have to get out there and say, we need these services funded. We need immigration services funded. We need to make sure that foster care goes through 21 and not just 18. We need to make sure that people with disabilities have the services they need. Our seniors have their home care, because these are unfortunately some of the issues that are on the chopping block. So again, this is where I call upon you to contact your state representatives, your state legislatures, and your state senators and the governor's office, because they need to hear from us to find out why this is so important. We have been told in the House of Representatives that new revenue is not going to be looked at until the governor's turnaround agenda passes. But if anybody has looked at the turnaround agenda, it's not going to pass through the legislature, because there's much of the agenda that talks about getting rid of unions. And if we were to rid ourselves of unions, it would really hurt the middle class. And we need to fight for the middle class in order for them to stay middle class. So these are issues that we have to work out together. So I'm calling upon you to group together to inform all of us, what are the services that are important to you? What do we need to make sure does not end up on the chopping block? Is it child care? Is it immigration services? There are so many needs in our community. And we can't treat the state budget like a business, because when you cut the bottom line, it's human lives that are cut at the bottom line. So we need to make sure that those protections do stay in place. So that is what is going on in Springfield right now. We are supposed to have our budget by May 31st. If we don't have it by the 31st, we'll go into overtime, and that's pretty much a likely scenario. I hope not. I've heard Springfield is very hot in July, and I don't want to be there. I want to be home. But we're going to do what we can to fight for what we need. Does that mean we're not going to see any cuts? No, we're probably going to see some cuts, because there needs to be some give and take. But we want it to be give and take. We don't want the people who need the most help to be the ones who suffer the most in the new budget year. So that is what we need to fight for. Does anybody have any questions?